record this. It's here. Okay. Record. Yeah. Okay.
Recording in progress.
Yeah. Okay. So where we got to last time was basically that there's this we discussed mostly the nigla or the gemara of it. There's both a bracha for putting on your shoes, which is just called sarki. We discussed one thing about that, which I could show you a little more here, which was let's actually we'll start from this in a minute. Which is how this kol sarki is relevant to shoes. We discussed a little bit about that. And then we saw how the Gemara in Masechtas Shabbos, in a different place, has a very intricate discussion about which shoe belongs to be put on first, right? Which side or which one is more important. We had a machloikes, Amiraim. One said it's the right one that's more important. We generally try to start with the right one. The other one made a gzera show from Tefillin, said that the left one is more important. And in order to do both, we discussed that the Gemara, the way Taisvis explained it, said that there's a difference between the tying your shoes, which belongs to the left, just like the tying your Tefillin, you tie it on your left hand, and the actually putting it on, which belongs to the right, as everything else starts with the right side. Okay. Now, in order to get into the meaning of that for the Arizal, we would have to basically go on these two steps, which is one, to discuss the meaning of shoes, what that means for him, and then we might be able to discern two different, in other words, the two sides, the left and the right, are not only like details in that thing. There would actually be two different aspects or two different parts of that meaning, and therefore we could try to understand both maybe the machloikes about what goes first, and even possibly even why we should be interested in trying to do both sides of this machloikes, right? So we'll let's start with the Ramak, because I like to do that. This is the Ramak's Perish, and then you see how the result takes that much further, so that's one of the interesting things to see in life. So the Ramak in his Siddur on Shas Likal Tzarki says like this. First thing he said was he noticed the language of Sho'osa, and in Kabbalah we know that we have four worlds, which are Atzilis, Bre, Yetzira, Asiya, and he quotes that we should look in Pardes Remaynim, and there's a shar called, I remember, Shar Abiyah or something like that, which discusses these four things. And now what he says is, and he gives two pshutim on this thing. One is, so we have to have this whole discussion about how the neshama of the person really starts in Atzilus and then went down all the way to Asiya. And now that we sent down the neshama all the way to Asiya, we need to provide for it all its needs in Olam Asiya. And that's just like Tzar. Given nimtza kol madregas Atzilus bebriya, kol madregas abriya beyetzira, kol madregas yetzira beasiya, v'ayni she'ostali perishem shech beasiya li kol hanitzrech li afilu min ala raglav. So in other words, this is reading it just like Tzarki, since we know that just like Tzarki is referring to your shoes. It's the last thing you need. So as just like in the order of getting dressed in the morning, first the last thing you put on is your shoes. So in other words, that symbolizes, that shows us how you have everything you need. And the deeper meaning of it in the Kabbalah language, what that shows is, you text me something? What that shows is that you have everything not only horizontally, you also have everything vertically. In other words, since your neshama is not really from here, it has a lot of needs, different needs, from Atzilas, from Bria, from Yetzira, from Asiya, all kinds of different kinds of needs, including shoes. Well, maybe we'll see what they actually mean. And the Shas Likal Tzarki is saying that although this neshama woke up and it finds itself back at Olam HaAsiyah, it has everything it needs, meaning all the other worlds that it needs. So that's one pshat. Now the second pshat, so this is the good pshat, right? As we talked last week, this is referring to what we gained from Shas Likal Tzarki, what we gained, how the how would you say, the richness and the being provided for everything. Now there's also a bad meaning protection aspect of it, which is another second Pshat Ramak says, the second aspect is talking about how shoes are there to protect you from mud and all kinds of dirt and things like that. And we learned that this actually also relates to the whole concept of Shasali, of the Shasiya. Because we learned that Lemal b'malchus, Ragleyer de Smuvas Kanoida. In other words, we know that, especially the Midas Malchus, but in other words, generally, or which itself is corresponds to Elamasiya, in other words, the aspect that can go down, so to speak, into Elamasiya, has this language called Ragleyer, this moves her feet go down to death, or go down to the Sha'il, to the, how do we say? And the Zohar reads this always as showing legs are always like the lowest part of the body, or the lowest, it's where the human being connects to the ground, or in other words, to everything outside of him, and you sort of don't have control over that. It's your hands. You could pick up. We talked in Tilas Yadayim about picking up your hands on the Tilas Yadayim, right? But your feet are always the aspect of you, or the aspect of, if we're talking about Elam Atzil, is the aspect of the spheres which are going down, which are descending to manage and to control and to lead and to do everything they need to do in Elam Hazeh. Now, when she does that, she needs to wear shoes. Why does she need to wear shoes? So her legs don't get dirty from going down to the Elamasiya. Now what is this shoes actually? The Ramak says, so there's some kind of, he calls it a klipa daka, something that's in between the Shekhinah and the universe and the Olam Asiyah, which is something that is, it sort of has some power to protect her, and it also is not part of her, right? If it would be part of her, then it would be into the same issue, because that would get dirty. So we need to have some sort of thing from a clip. He calls it a klipa daka, which is like the paroiches, like the thing that divides the Shekhinah from the Olam Asiyah. So, what?
Is it unusual
for? I cannot hear.
Is it unusual for klipa here to be used? We're talking about something that seemingly is like that in Southern Kedusha.
Oh, he said, that's why he says klipa daka. No, because I think that the logic is that if it would be the Kedusha itself, then you would have the same problem. So there's always these levels in between that. We'll see that Rizal has, I think, a better explanation of this, because he's sort of bothered by this, and he figures out the structure a lot better. I think that's why it's good to do this, because you see sort of what the problems are, or what the issues are. That Rizal has a much more elaborate explanation of what this klipa means and how it would work, actually. Klipa literally means shell, right? So shells, and again, in the classic example of the shells of eggers of a nut, it's also there to protect. It's not really evil. That's really what we discussed last week, a little bit of how we get to evil or to badness out of this concept. But to him, it must be something that doesn't hurt her, and it sort of serves as a, how would he call it, like a space. It's like a boundary between the two things, like klipas noiga or something like that. But yes, we do need to have a better explanation for this. This is something it's not defined enough and not explained enough. So we would have to, for that we could use that. Rizal is actually very interested in this question, and we're going to get to that. Okay, so that Rizal actually goes back to these two different things that we keep on thinking of. In other words, you could ask the same question: Where do you get the power to wear shoes? In other words, to put your feet out in the world, or for the Shekhinah to put her feet out of the world and not get dirty? Like the Ramak quotes the pasuk "Rechatzti es ragla," right? Which is Shira Shirim, which is talking about the, right? Yeah, talking about the Shekhinah, right? How do you do that? How do you create that? And the result actually starts with the good part of it. In other words, how it comes from. And this is where he starts. This is the results. What you have to be mechaven when you put on your shoes. Kine ima ila hi aman LSS zon zernukva b'neh, b'soid kanesha yorkine al gazela virachef, imeisem oisam teichkenafav. So now the Arizal, as always, is thinking in his much more elaborate image. Like here, right, he has almost a family image with the ima, which is the mother, and zon, which are her children. And of course, what we're interested in, or what we are, is the children. And now he thinks of, and we should have looked up if the Zohar uses this pasuk in this way, but I don't see right here something easily. I'm sure it does. I'm sure this has a source in Zohar and other sources. But the idea is that we learn that in Rashi, in Kaneshi or Kinai, right? If you remember Rashi in Parshas Yisra, it talks about. This is not in Parshas Yisra, right? This is in. Where in Parshas Yisra there's something similar where it talks about Ve'esa eschem al kanfen eshorim. And Rashi explains that the Nesher has this thing where he himself is the thing that covers his children, right? So remember Rashi in Parshas Yisra says on the pasuk Ve'esa eschem al kanfen eshorim says that this is referring to the pasuk Vayuve machne that the Malach Elohim by the no in the it's also Rashi here in Kenesh Yokenem Vashsazina says that all the birds, when they carry their children, they carry them under them because they're afraid of birds flying higher than them that would catch them. That's the mashal that he thinks of. But the Nesher, since he can fly the highest, he's not really afraid of any other birds, but he's afraid of people with their arrows which are going to shoot him. Therefore, he carries his children, or she carries her children, we would say. She carries her children on her back, on her wings, and she says, let me be the protector of my children. Rather, if there's someone's gonna shoot an arrow at me, it will go into me, and I'll be the protector of my children with my body. Right? It's a human bird shield, not a human shield. It's a bird shield. Now this is the radical thing that the Rizal says. In other words, if we talk about, and again, the Rizal keeps on thinking of the spheres and the image of not only like being one thing, of he has this whole dynamic with Ima and Za, which is one of the most important dynamics of the Rizal's interested in. The mother who takes care of her children and feeds them and gives them moichin, right? That's what literally called food. If you learn Kavanas Achille, you'll see that, and everything, and clothing and everything else. So Ima Elah is the one who gives clothing to her children, which are the Teferes and the Malchus, or the Za and the Nuk. And now this clothing is actually Ima herself, or he's going to say in the next piece. He calls it the Malbasha Achrin of Ima. We'll try to figure out exactly what that is. But in any case, and what he's referring to, the Pasuk Nesher Yakneh, seems to be this, where the Nesher is itself the clothing of her children. So when you put on your shoes or your clothing, he's going to say that really it's all clothing are like this, but shoes has just a particular aspect of this. Really referring to Ima giving something to her children. And this is the very standard. Anyone that learns any page in Kisveri knows that any Moichin, anything, any Shefa that we talk about, Zon getting any Shefa, it always goes through Ima. Then generally we talk about Nahid Ima, which go into Za and become Kailim for their Moichin, and so on. There's a lot of different ways of how to, a lot of details in that thing, but this is the most general thing. He always thinks of, if you're Za, he doesn't only think of you getting Moichin, he also thinks of where you're getting them, right? Last Thursday we talked about the sleep, where you go back into Ima and so on. It's always going to be relevant to think of what Ima is doing here. So now, generally everything the Zon get is from Ima, including the clothing. And now what the radical thing he says here is that the clothing are actually Ima herself, like he says, in other words, the image that he has is sort of like Kanafaim can be not only wings, it can literally mean clothing, right? It means you spread your clothing on me, right? So put me into your talis, or into your dress. And when you put on your clothing or when you put on your shoes, you should really see yourself as being put into a higher state. So the interesting thing here, what I want to get at, and we'll see that Rizal also touches this dynamic, is that the clothing of the lower level, or the clothing of the lower partsif, or if you think of partsifim like Nuk, or you can think about a human being also, the clothing of the lower partsif are actually a higher thing from itself. Because the thing of itself is Zah, or whatever that level that is. And their clothing is actually him going into, or not going into, but Ima spreading her wings over him. Kanesha Yerakina, like the Nesher spreads his wings over his children, or her wings over her children, should be Nesher, I don't know how you say Nekeva Nesher. Nesheret, I don't know. Mrs. Nesher. And see, actually it says Lishan Zachar in the Pasuk, so I don't know, but he seems to read it as a feminine. That's really the clothing, and that is all going to say that's actually why. And we have to think about why. We'll get to that in a minute, but we have to think about why, how the clothing or her shoes have the power to repel the chitzainim or repel the dirt. Like, how could shoes be better than you yourself? This is a question that you should wonder about when you get dressed. Like, obviously, anyone that has some sort of ontology of the world would assume human, at least if you're, you assume that humans have some higher level than, I don't know, whatever fabric or whatever thing you made your shoe out of, right? It's usually made out of animals, leather or anything like that. So it seems to be weird, and this is a question that people are worried about. The Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya, is very interested in this question about food. Also, how could it be that food, which is doimem, tzemeach, chai, and so on, how could that actually provide life to a human? It seems to be upside down. We should be so, of course, humans should be eaten by other animals. No, but we should be the one providing, and it seems very often, and this is generally the concept of humans using tools and clothing, all these kinds of things which are become an extension of the human body or of the human mind, of the human soul, and they're always things that seem to be outside of them, or things that seem to be should have been a lower level of you, and now how is this helpful to you? And there's really two ways in which we could think about it, and these two ways you could go very far if you think about this concept. There's really two ways you could think about it. And the Rizal himself is going to talk about these two ways, and it's not entirely clear how he conceptualizes it in his system. But the two ways he thinks about it, the first way he always thinks about it is that really the clothing are from a higher level of you. Like, in other words, if you ask who are the clothing of Zon, they're really Imma. They're not Zon's clothing. In other words, you would think that Imma, like we generally have this inner-outer hierarchy, right? The more inner the higher level, or maybe we shouldn't say higher, that's a vertical concept, but the more internal, right? That's modern people like the inner-outer kind of hierarchy. The more internal you are, the more true, or the more holy, or the more whatever you want to call it, and the more outer is the lower level. Like you would say, a person has his heart or his soul inside his heart, and then he has maybe some spirit that manages his body, and then he has his blood, and then he has his bones, and then he has tissue, flesh, and then he has skin, and so on. And skin is the last level of the body, and then over that, even further than that, he would have clothing, shoes or clothing, and so on. And then it would be sort of weird to how the last level that you have is the one that touches the outside. And when you touch the outside, you actually need a lot of power to repel all the evilness and all the hardship that exists outside. And of course, this is not really a question. Darizal is very interested in this, and this actually, we'll get to the next piece, this actually gets to his whole system of how he sees inside and outside, and how he sees the structure, what's called the structure of all the universes, or all the elements, how he sees them. So he sees a paradox in this. And at least one of his answers, and the answer that he gives right here, is that the malbish of the person is not actually him. That's actually why it's not part of you, because it actually comes from your mother, it comes from the Imma, it comes from a higher level of you. And that's what causes it to have the power to repel the chitzayim. So this is the first thing that he says. Vinay. So we have to learn some names. Firstly, what this is called. Firstly, we know that the Imma is what gives everything to Zon. Now we know that Imma herself, let's talk about Imma herself, has a lot of different levels. So we can talk about her Meichen, her Kailem, her Levishim, and so on. And now the Hanamalbish Achitza and Imma Ela Nikra Chashmal. Now Imma herself has what's called the last levish, or the last clothing that she has. That's called Chashmal. And Chashmal is, of course, a language that we got from Yechezkel, and Yechezkel seems to describe whatever it seems to be describing, the Spheres, I guess, according to Kabbalah, he describes them as being enclosed in Chashmal. At least that's the way the Arizal reads it. We would have to read those psukim to see exactly. But the way he reads that is that the Chashmal is the thing from within the Chashmal. He sees the Kisei HaKavod or the Merkava and so on. And therefore the Arizal read Chashmal generally, and he has a remez, Chashmal Gematria Malbesh. That's almost the same letters, just has to skip. You have to just break up the ches into a bez and to get malbash from Chashmal. And the Rizal always understands Chashmal to be the levush of Ima. That's called Chashmal. V'zel malbash, malbash is makavazan. This malbash is not only, right, if for example, just a good place to remember this, is the Rizal says in the end of Shemana Esrei, we say, Am Verches Am Yisrael Basholem. And the Rizal says, because this is a good kavanah, because it has a meaning, at least to me. The Rizal says, Basholem is Oisias Malbash. So again, Basholem is literally the same Oisias as Malbash, and that's Chashmal. And the meaning of it, as he says, is since by Shemana Esrei you achieved all these Oiris L'Yonim, you created Yechidim, now that needs protection. This is a general concept that Rizal has always, and also here. Whenever you do something good, you need to give it a protection afterwards. For example, another example would be Sukkot, when we do the whole Seder of Sukkot, of Nilev and everything, and then we do Hakufas, and the Rizal understands Hakufas to be a creating of protection, like as if you create. He literally says it as if you create a barrier, a wall around your iris, and that's his kavanah called Mugan, and that becomes the shield around the city that you built in Tefillah. And the same thing, every time you do Shemana Esrei, you need to always make sure to create this protection around it. Basically, because if the yichud of tefillah would be exposed, and he sometimes uses a sexual imagery, you cannot expose the yichud because it would get hurt, it would get desecrated from being looked at from outsiders and so on. So you need to create a protection around it, and that's Bashalem. Bashalem is Malbash and it's Gematria Chashmal, and different kavanahs of how to exactly create this, shield. But that's the concept of the Chashmal, and always the same thing. So the Imma, and you sometimes conceptualize this as a chuppah. So if you have the idea of a wedding existing in a chuppah, so you put the Zuchar and the Kaiva, or the Zun, the Chassan and the Kala are going in the chuppah, and the chuppah is again the Imma Ilah, the Chashmal, which surrounds them, and now you have a little bit of another understanding of this idea that I was talking about of needing a protection which is sort of intermediates between the inside and the outside, which sort of creates a space, both so the inside should have its space and not, you don't want to need to argue with the outside all the time. And this mechitza, this chuppah or this levush that created needs to have the strength. It needs to have it can't be, that's the point. That's what, going back to, for example, what you asked, if that would be why that has to be some sort of klipa or some sort of outer thing. It's like the bouncer, right? You need like a very big fat bouncer at the door of your temple to push out the things that you don't want to push out. And you're not going to put the chassan and kala themselves to be the bouncer. That's not how it works. He sort of has, I don't know if you want to entirely conceptualize it like a bouncer, like has a dirty job, like has to be the bad guy. But you need, all good things in the world need bouncers around them. And that's the levush, that's the chashmal, he called chashmal, which is malbish. Now this is important thing, and there's a technical note that Arizal says. In other words, I think what he mostly means to say here, again we have to read, there's a whole shar in Yitzchok called Shara Chashmal, and other places where he gets into a lot more technical details about all of these things. But in general, in other words, we have to remember that in general we have something called Or Makif. And everyone who learns Kisvari knows that there's Or Pnimi and Or Makif. Or Pnimi is the light that can be encompassed, that can be that the vessel or the kli or the za and anything you want to call it actually can have within itself, like the neshama, or like we talk something like food, like something that you could literally eat. You could grasp it. That's the intellectual world, or you could emotionally you could hold it. and so on. And then there's the Or Makif, which is the part of the part of the Or, the part of the light that you cannot literally grasp. That's too great, it's too big to move into the Kli, but it's that is all conceptualized as standing around the person. And every person or every Kli, everything always has like an aura, like a aura that's around it. But Rizal says that's not what we're talking about here, because then when we talk about the Or Makif of Zah, generally we say Zah has Naran is Pnimi, Chai Yechid Makif, different language for that. That's all Oiris of Zah. So that's not helpful enough for us. What we need here, and it's true that the Or Makif to Zah is connected to Bina, just like everything else that he gets is from Bina. Maybe the Or Makif has some sort of specific connection to Bina, but we're not talking about that. What we're talking about now is literally the Or of Bina herself. The Ima herself, which is surrounding Zah, and becomes the Malbish of Zah. I think another meaning of that would be that when we talk about Or Makif, there's some sort of connection. It's something that you need. You might not literally be able to. You can't internalize it, right? But it's still something that's relevant to you in some way. When we talk about Levush, it's literally something separate. So it's literally something from the Ima, but the Ima has this power to repel the Chitzanim and so on. And this is what he's going to say. Fitam. Now here he gives two meanings. Let's see what's the next. Here he gives two reasons, two mechanisms, basic really, for how this should work. In other words, how does this levush of Ima that surrounds the zon, how does this enable it to not be, to not get what Arizal calls a chizas achitzonim, right, for the more outer levels or the more harmful things, not to touch it. So you should have known already, and this is something again which Arizal discussed in many different places, in different ways, in different levels, but in general we can understand. So generally we can understand that Chetzonim is a low level, is a thing, and of course, obviously, something that is extremely elevated, something that's on a much higher level, the Chetzonim will not be able to touch that. So, for general, over here, sometimes he has different ways exactly to define the address, up until where the Chetzonim have an achiza, and from where they don't. This is something very complicated to figure out exactly. But in general, he says over here and many other places that Chitzonim can only have an achiza in zon. So in the 7 Sfiras, for example, all these things go back really to the Shvira, if you want to learn the whole structure, because there's only Shviras HaKailim, mostly in the Sheva Melachim, which are the zon, and the Ima has some Shvira, but not literal, so that's really where this all has to go back. But anyways, what was I saying? So the Chitzonim cannot have an achiza only in zon, not in Ima. So Bina, once you get, that's why the Zohar says, for example, in Bina, when you get Bina, you have Chayris. We discussed the sun on Pesach and Purim different times. Once you get to the level of Bina, then you're free of Yetzer Hara, then you're free of Chitzonim. In general, it's not as simple as that, but in general, it works like this. Now, and therefore, going back to where we are, because if the levush is from Ima, so there's some weird, so we have this weird, upset, counterintuitive thing where the outer level of the zon really comes from a higher level, and that is what serves as the gate. That's what's called serves as the guard to not let the Chitzonim in. So what doesn't let the Chitzonim in is the Od of Ima, or what he calls the Malbish of Ima, which is outside of zon. And in other words, although they would have been able to get to zon, but they cannot get to Ima. So it's in zon, and now this is the logic of Kenesha Yorkinai, where the higher the mother, so to speak, puts herself outside, like Rashi talks about the Zik, that the Malach Elohim, which here would correspond to Bina, went between the Ben Machne Yisrael and Machne Mitzrayim. So again, it's, or another example, another midrashic example for this would be a very famous story with Inkeles, which talked about the mezuzah, right? He said that Melech B'Sav Adam sits inside and his guards from outside, and the relationship that we have with God is sometimes the opposite, where we sit inside the house, and the mezuzah, which is the Shmirah, where God watches you, is on the outside. And again, that is, I would conceptualize that as why that would be. And again, we could refer to another example from the story of Mitzrayim, pshat that says in I'm not sure where, but for example, there's this pshat that says says Aniv le'malach, Aniv le'shliach, that the God himself, whatever that exactly means, had to go down into Mitzrayim and not send his usual way of doing it with the malach and so on. And it's one of the reasons given for that is because God, a malach which would go down to Mitzrayim would get stuck. In other words, would get stuck with the tumah, with the whatever evilness is going on in Mitzrayim. And like we know the story of Azav Azal, sometimes malachim can themselves be influenced by what's going on over here. God himself obviously doesn't have that issue. So therefore God becomes, so in other words, therefore the higher level becomes the Meshuras. He becomes the one protecting the lower level, because the lower level would not be able to protect itself. So just like a small child cannot protect itself, so it needs the mother to surround it. The same thing, human beings need God to surround them, to help them. Although it's really weird, we should be helping God, not God helping us. But that's still how it happens. Okay, if you want a way to do it, like well, this is the structure that he has, with the logic that he has. So this is what it says. L'chan, k'day shlo yichlech etzenu l's'achas b'hem mini imem agine aleim, mefsekes b'enu v'en etzenu l'day zay chashmal amchas aleim, asher miyat min oir hazon. So here he says something interesting. Also, Silas yes nimshich min imem lo af bish oir v'mit, enem yichol n's'achas b'yach etzenim k'nizkar. So now he's sort of transitioning almost to the opposite way of thinking about this. Because of course we have to understand that even if I talk about the zon being surrounded by Ima, if I talk about the levush as being Ima going around them, you can't think of it as actually turning over the hierarchy. That would be really wrong. In other words, not wrong because it would be bad because we have a hierarchy to keep up, but it just doesn't make sense. So you have to still understand that this levush is still a levush to zon. It didn't become imma. The zon didn't become imma, and imma didn't become smaller than zon. So this all doesn't really happen in the most literal way. In other words, we have to think of different relativities here, right? We have to think of if the lowest level of Ima is actually bigger or smaller than the regular level of Zon. And basically what he says here is that it's not. And this is sort of sometimes contradicts. You have to figure out, because it also contradicts what he says right here. It says, although it's technically, if you think about the strength of the light, it would be less light than the zon itself has, but it's still, because it's from so we need to try to understand this. This recording
in progress.
Yeah, so we have to basically understand that there's two different, we could call them kamas and eichas, I guess, or something like that. So there's two different how do you call it, scales that we have to measure things or describe things by. We could talk about a qualitative thing. In other words, if you're imma, then you're different from za, just by virtue of being imma, right? Imma has its own qualities and its own powers. By definition, imma basically means that which is the source of the merchen and everything for zon, and that's itself a thing. Or maybe we could find more definitions of it. In other words, where the definition that sort of makes sense is, like we discussed, that if Ima is before it's like the step before the birth, or before the actual revelation of the zone, which is where once things are open, that's the Rizal's general understanding. Once things are created, are like outside of the womb, so to speak, that's where we start getting issues. And Imma herself, there might be, we have this whole conversation about Imma Dinim Mis'arin, but anyways, that Rizal, after the Ramak, always understands that an Imma itself, herself, there are never Dinim or Klippas. It's only once things come out of Imma that we could have Klippas. So therefore, once you have Imma, that itself is a protection from Klippas. Although, so now we get this although if you would count how much there is, or how much light, how you could call it the quantity of light, it's actually less than Za himself, right? This does not necessarily mean that the amount of light in the Levisha Achrin Shel Imma, which is the Chashmal, is actually more than the amount of light in Za. In other words, it's not because it's more powerful, the light, that it's overpowering the Chetzonim. It's because it's a different quality of light. In other words, because it's from Imma. And because obviously it wouldn't make sense to have the Levish of Za be really more powerful, have more light than Za himself. So we still understand that that was his language that he said. Did he say that it was? Yeah. I don't know where I saw that it says that it's less than Za. Yeah, it says right. So it's less, and that although it's less because it's from Imma, it protects the Za. And then he has a third scale. So there's sort of three scales. This is how I understand it. I've heard people understand it differently, but this is how I understand it. The third scale is something he calls obvious. Instead, we're up to here in Az Gimel. So he gave one reason. At the Tamal of the Levish, since it's from Imma, it protects the Za from Chetzonim, because Imma is Soyse Chetzonim cannot get to Imma. And the second reason, Sibachir, is ki obvious Za Chashmal Mafsik, so it's not clear what he means. Again, I've heard people explain that there was a third scale here. So we could talk about how much light we have, we could talk about what kind of light it is, and we could talk about how the Rizal's language is, this is a language that Rizal uses a lot in different contexts, how thick it is, or how, what's the English word that I used for this? Coarse, I think of means like something like coarse, as versus fine, or versus refined. And we have a general idea of that Rizal talks about Kailim as being Av and Gas, and versus Oir, that's Dak, and whatever the opposite of Gas is, fine. So some people understood that there's something in this Oir of since it's the Levish Achrin Shel Imma, since it's the slowest Levish of Imma, so it has some sort of like my example of the bouncer guy. So it has this bully kind of thing in it, where it pushes away the Chitzonim. That's the obvious of the Chashmal. Now the problem with this theory is that it's sort of contradicts, even after we make a different achilek between the quantity and the quality, or the kamas and the eiches of the oil, and we say, okay, it's less oil but has the quality of Imma, that still is assuming that there's some highness or some elevation, some purity or some different quality, we could say, of the light that's pushing away the chitzanim. Here he seems to say the total opposite, where it says it's generally Av literally means less. Maybe we could call it a third thing, like it's not quality and not quantity. It's basically some kind of quality, right? Where it's less pure, less refined, and since it's less refined, it has like this power kind of thing, like this. Like any brand of protection, right? You want to protect something, you're going to put something strong or something hard or something. Makes sense?
Yeah, I think so.
So that's how some people understood it, but I feel like that's still the opposite. Still doesn't make enough sense to me. What some people, because we generally assume that Klippas would be happy with anything they can get. So you say, okay, this is like a more Av, so therefore it's pushing him away, can't get to it. Like one way, I've heard someone explaining it is, you need to be, like, it's the Goldilocks principle. Like we need, and the Goldilocks principle is the Rizal's principle not only for clippers, it's his principle for us being able to be masig or in general, right? The Rizal always says if it's too high you can't get it, if it's too low you can't get it. It has to be just right. And he seems to be saying something similar here for the clippers. Like if it's too high, if it's imma, then you can't get it. If it's too low, it's too av, then they can't get it. So it has to be revealed enough. That would be one way of understanding it. But then he's saying this is contradicting himself in like the same thing. You can't say, well, this is the exact chashmal that's pushing them away, both because he's too high and because he's too low. Maybe some people. Okay, if you stop hearing me, let me know. It should be working now.
Yeah.
Now it stopped to work again. I don't know.
Now I hear you.
Yeah, okay. So that's the problem with this. Therefore, I don't think this is actually what he means, although it might be a nice idea in general. I think that what he actually means is that there's sort of two ways to conceptualize, and I think this is preparing to the next piece where he's going to get into his whole structure of how things are, and I think that's a lead to that. In other words, I think that he's first saying that there's some kind of overpowering effect of the chashmal that overpowers the chitzanim. That's one thing. And then we could think about a simpler thing. We could speak about it just being a barrier to the chitzanim, right? There's two kinds. There's like we could call it active protection and passive protection, right? If you have a gate, that's just a gate, and you need another hurdle to get passed through, and they can't pass through. Or you could get a guard or someone to just push them away, which must have some higher power like Ima. So I think that what he really says, that's why I would focus on the word mafsik, right? You see, he's not saying ki uvi zeh chashmal doiches chitzanim. He's saying ki uvi zeh chashmal mafsik. So since the chashmal is between, and he'll go on to explain exactly why it turns out that this chashmal is literally the thing in between the chitzanim and the zon, or and the nuk. That's why I think that's what he really means to say over here with uvi zeh chashmal mafsik. So they have another more way to go, and it's not letting them have direct. You could say it's not letting them have direct access to the zon. Maybe they do have through the chashmal some access, because obviously chitzanim exist, and if they exist, they must be actually getting some shefa. If not, they would stop existing. It probably means that it's getting through the chitzanim, and therefore they're not touching the zon itself. Okay, that's basically my summary of the confusing thing that maybe it's not. Maybe I just made it confusing when it's not really that as confusing, just to me. Okay, so just to summarize, so we have the first pshat, the first kavanah of nal and clothing and shoes, which are that the one being malbish, the one dressing, the one surrounding zon is imeilah, and that's also what you're supposed to be mechavan when you get dressed, that it's imeilah dressing you, or being actually, like you said, kineshia, actually surrounding the zah, and the point of that is in order to not allow different chitzainim to touch the zon. In other words, you could already see that, just going back to something we discussed last time, you could already see that this levush existing is extremely important. That's why, going back to, for example, we talk about, the Rizal discusses this in a slightly different way in Shara Mitzvahs and Parshas, trying to remember where he talks about Avelis. When you be'avilis, there's something called the kriya, where you rip your clothing. That's an act of avelis. Or there's, like we talked about tishbav, where you don't wear your clothing, you don't wear shoes, and all of that would symbolize in this way how chizas hachitzayim, basically. Since you're sad and you don't have shechina, so you don't have protection, so you have chizas hachitzayim, so you have you rip your clothes. So it's like, you would think that ripping clothes is a good thing, right? It's like revealing. That's often what we want to do, and the result turns out to be a bad thing, because both of something deeper that he always has, which is that if things are not enclosed, you can't actually be massing them, because it would be too high because of our Goldilocks problem. And secondly, and it might be connected to the same idea, because the Chetzonim will be able to touch the Shechina herself, or the Nuk. So ripping clothing, or we talked about the Medrash, which says Pitza and Rissa, that God ripped his garment. Or like story of Titus ripping the peroiches. That's all this kind of concept. So it's very important to have clothing which are protective of your whatever you have. So we discussed that a little last time more. Okay, now we have to get into the Arizal's, and this is going to be this main part here. We get into the Arizal's entire structure of the LMS. Why? And I think this is all to explain why this Chashmal is literally standing in between the Klippa and the Nook, and the Zah and the Nook. We'll see exactly. And based on that structure, he's going to explain us the whole everything we have to get to with the right and the left and all of that. Hope we'll be able to follow it. I didn't find a good picture that shows this, so maybe I could try to make my pictures, but we'll see if it works. So he says like this. I'm going to read it and we'll try to make it clear. So we have to have the results. And this you have to have in your head if you want to understand Kisva Arizal generally. You have to have in your head the Arizal's general structure of Ratzifim. It's working now, right?
Yeah, it was also working before, just coming through a little.
Yeah, my connector, maybe you have a solution. The connector keeps on like falling out and somehow I should buy a new one. I don't know if it's going to help. Okay. I don't know if it's the Melshpia or the Makabel that's broken. Okay. What? Very frustrating. It's like little tiny things that. Okay.
Isn't the Avoda in life to know?
Yeah, but it's very frustrating because it's like little tiny. Every time you shake the table, it breaks. I can't have this. It needs to be more robust. It needs to have like a chashmal to protect it. Okay. Anyways, anyone that learns Kisva Arizal knows like this, okay? I'm gonna make a picture. I try to draw pictures like this in my other class. Sometimes people understand and sometimes not. This is what we're gonna try to do. Everyone knows that the Atzilus looks like this, okay? This is Arich, okay? Ignore the scale and stuff like that. Sorry, that's Atik. This is Arich. This is Abba Ve'ima. And this is Zah, okay? Now you have to imagine this as being a full circle, right? It's really all around. But in other words, this is the most internal thing, and the text doesn't really work when I put it here, so I don't know how to do it. Right, Atik, it's not working. My keyboard is not working, so we're gonna have to. I don't know how to make these things much smaller so they fit into the thing. So basically, Atik. Whoa, how do we make the text smaller? Also, there must be a way, right? I don't know how. Anyways, whoops, it went away. I don't know how this works. Okay, so the first one is Atik, then there's Atik. So these are four, they're both higher than each other. That's one thing that you have to remember, but we're not referring to that right now. In other words, the most internal one is Atik, and on Atik, on the Zata Atik, basically. You should know this by now. On the Zata, the Garda Atik is Megillah on top, and the Zayin Tachtan is Atik are covered by Arich outside of him, right? So similar to the way when you dress, you generally don't dress your head, you dress your body. So the head of everything is open, revealed. The body gets enclosed by the next parts of. So Arich is Malbish and Arich. And same thing, something similar happens to Abba Ve'ima. Abba Ve'ima are Malbish. Again, Zayin Tachtan is the Arich. More or less. We'll get to exactly how in a different place. And in the similar way, Abba Ve'ima, although they're two Partzufim, they have the same height, right? Because they're the Zohar and the Kaiva. So because if you learn Netzitz Chaim, you'll know that really, when we say Atik, we really mean Atik V'nuk. And we say Arich, we really mean Arich V'nuk. So there's really, all of them are double, but anyways. So there's really 8 Partzufim in this picture, not only 4, but anyways. And then Abba Ve'ima are Malbish to Arich up to this. And up to their Zat again, and same thing Zat ad ve'imar Zoner malbish to Zayin Tachtonis of Abim. Sometimes the Rizal says not Zayin Tachtonis, but half, like Chatzi Teferes, but that's generally how we assume it to be by Abavim and Zon, but that's we're not gonna get into this, not relevant right now. Anyway, this is our general picture of Atzilus, so you have to read it from inside to outside, right? The right side is inside, then the more you go to the left, it gets outside. That's in my diagram. I don't know why I did it this way, but okay. Now, Hayatzlanim is Kibchinas Oiras Apnimim. I'm reading here because I have to show you the next thing. So this is all considered the level of Oid Pnimi. Something interesting, because we learned that every part of this is one of the Rizal's most basic Chidushim. I think that he literally made it up. Maybe it's earlier. I don't remember that Ramak has the same idea, but if like it's right in the beginning of Shana Akdemis, where he talks about every part of having the Ar Pnimi, which is, again, this has to do with the Kli, right? Ar Pnimi is the Ar that the Kli can grasp, the Kli can enclose. It's another way of saying really, but the Ar that's in the Kli. And Ar Makif is the Ar that is surrounding, right? It's outside of the Kli, because the Kli cannot... no, I need a good word for this. The Kli cannot subsume it, something like that. Like it cannot have it inside of it. Okay, so now you would have thought, and this is the interesting thing, you would have thought that each one, so if you look, this is Atik, so you would have Ar Pnimi somewhere. Do you see my mouse playing around? I'm not sure. You would have Ar Pnimi somewhere here and Ar Makif somewhere there, or something like that. And the Rizal says, at least in the most general, and this is something we have to very well figure out if you want to have a clearer picture, but this is a general picture of Elemis, and it's also from the beginning of its time, this picture, that the Ar Makif of the Partzifim are actually have a opposite way of working than this Ar Pnimi. And that's an important thing. Because in Ar Pnimi, whoever is more internal is holier. In Ar Makif, it actually has the total opposite logic, which is that whoever is more external, well, external is not the exactly correct word, but whoever is the greater, so in other words, he sort of seems to think of Makif here in the logic of what we learned in the beginning of its Chaim about a Gulim. So Ar Makif is for the furthest, the most outside circle would be the greater, the higher level, so to speak. And in other words, what happens is that the I'm going to try to make a picture. I'm not sure how I could make a picture. Something like this. In other words, what happens is that the Ar Makif of the Atik, for example, is actually very far from the Ar Pnimi, the Atik. Because you have something like this. If this is the zone, then this would be... Wow. No, I don't know. Nicer picture. If you have the zone, then this would be Ar Makif the Zah. So the Ar Makif of zone are around the Zah. Now the Ar Makif of Abba, the Imma, are actually going to look like this. So this picture actually shows you how it sort of makes sense, this structure that he has, right? And the Ar Makif of Arich would be like this, and the Ar Makif of Atik is like this. In other words, the Ar Makif of each doesn't only Makif himself, but it's also Makif all the other Patzifim below him. Okay? And the reason, and he explains this. So does this picture make any sense? It's a nice picture. I like it. Okay, so now if you could find the text behind the picture, I'm gonna delete the picture in a minute. Does this help? This helps you to know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it looks like Igulim in your shirt. No?
Yeah, it looks like, but it's not actually. At least he doesn't say that it's the same. That it's that. That's what I said. It has a similar logic, but it's actually the makif of the Yosha. This is all Yosha really, because Igulim is the whole other. This is all Ar Makif the Yosha. This is actually what it says openly in the beginning of its Chaim. But the Ar Makif does have a thing where he is going to, in other words, and he's going to, in other words, you can't, it wouldn't really make sense, and he's going to explain this. So if you read, let me do something like this. I'm going to take this, save this picture, and then I'm going to delete it. And you clear the whole thing. So now we go back to where we are. He says like this, V'tam v'hamnan. So let's just read to what he says, because you see that he's trying to give you this picture in his words. The Atik, right, the right one of my previous picture. So the most, in other words, if you're traveling in the Midbar sometimes, and you meet Atzilus, you bump into Olam Atzilus, what you're going to bump into is the Nuk, right? Or in other words, the Or Pnimi, the Nuk, if you're coming from the outside, right? I don't know exactly in which spaceship you drive, but that's what should happen. But we're talking about the Chitzonim, so they're driving and they're coming, so that's why we have to think about this. But it's actually more complicated. So like in our picture, if you look on the Za, then of course right next to her would be the Pnimi de Nuk. Full of Makif or the Za. Okay, so here he's separating Nuk and Za, because we're going to see that it's slightly different. So the Makif of Atik is actually what would happen if you would come from totally outside of Atzilus, you would actually bump into the Or Makif of Atik, not into the Nuk, because on top of the Nuk is Nuk, Makif the Nuk. On top of that is Makif da Bevima. On top of that is Makif da Arich. On top of that is Makif da Atik. Therefore, anyone that bumps into Atzilus actually bumps into Or Makif, the Atik. So really, you should remember, if you drive your spaceship, if you come from the side, if you don't come from the middle, the Chitzonim you're going to see are actually in the middle. And actually, it seems like we're also in the middle, so maybe. But at least if you would come from the side, you would bump into the Or Makif da Za. And the Tamadov, and there's a reason, it makes sense. Because what would happen so in other words, what he's saying is that it would be very weird, and it's actually kind of weird because it does happen for the Or Pnimi, right? You say the Or Pnimi of the Atik is Milibish in Arich and so on. But for some reason for the Or Makif, he's not happy with that, and he says that it wouldn't make sense for the Abba V'Ima. Really what it's saying is something like this: if the Atik himself can't be Malbish, can't accept, can't internalize, that's another word that I would say for Makif, right? For Pnimi. If the Atik himself can't internalize the Or Makif, how could the Abba V'Ima internalize the Or Makif, the Atik? So the Or Makif would have to skip over the Abba V'Ima or Arich, wherever we are, the next parts of, and be outside of that too. Because the called concept of Or Makif is what we cannot actually internalize, or what we can't actually accept, receive. So it wouldn't make sense to put, okay, you didn't read the Or Pnimi. In other words, it wouldn't make sense that between the Or Pnimi, the Abba, for example, it would be the Or Makif, the Abba, and then the Zun. Because that would say that the Zun have actually inside of them, so to speak, the Or Makif, the Abba, and that's nonsense. That's impossible. So therefore, the Or Makif therefore we end up with the opposite structure in Or Makif, right? So the greater you are, the further you are, because that's what Makif means. Or Makif means what you cannot actually grasp. So the greater you are, the further you are from. This is this to look into this, to be misborn into this basic idea of like the Or Pnimi having this thing of being the most internal thing, and the Or Makif being the thing of being the most external thing. And yeah, like you said, it does sort of match to the idea of Gilim V'Yosher. Just both this, we're not literally talking about what Arizal calls the Gilim, but it still works with a similar logic. And this is a whole other story to talk about. We're not getting into the meaning and things of that, but that's a basic structure. So now we have to go back to our picture and think, where are the klippas? Okay, but basically, where is everything else? Right? Not only the klippas, everything after the Nuk. We know that the Nuk is what creates Olam Hazeh, basically, or all the next Olam Abriya. Where are they? Or we could say right now, where are the klippas? So he says, so it turns out, I want to find, let's see if I could find the picture that I saved. Do you know where I could find it? Whoa. Where can I find it? I know where. Second. Yeah. Okay. Wait, but I need to somehow share that now. I'm gonna do this and then I'll be able to do this. Okay. Yeah, you have my picture? See my picture?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Okay, turns out that the klippas are over here. How do I make color on this now? Gosh. Okay. Turns out if you're looking for klippas, this is where you're going to find them. You're going to find them right here. Klippas. Okay? In between the Or Pnimi of Nuk and the Or Makif of Nuk, that's where the klippas are. Because if you think about it, this is the lowest space, right? if you're looking for the lowest space, it's not outside, because if you're going all the way outside, then you get stuck into the makif situation where outside is actually bigger than pnimi. And if you go all the way inside, all the way the other way, all the way internal, of course, then you get into the makif pnimi situation where the internal is the highest. So the actual place of the lowest place actually is in between the Or Makif Denuk and Or Pnimi Denuk. So that's a very interesting location for the klippos to exist in, and that is all. Again, he says this also over there in the beginning of Yitzchok. So this is where all the klippos are. So in other words, all klippos, and this is why you're going to start seeing that the Nuk is actually so in such a dangerous space, because all klippos are literally in between the Or Pnimi. In other words, if you think about there's more to think about this, but in other words, the space between Or Makif and Or Pnimi is where klippos are generally, or especially if we look at the Nuk, the space between Or Pnimi of the Attic and the Or Makif the Attic is actually the whole world, right? But the place between the Or Pnimi the Nuk and Or Makif the Nuk is the space for the klippos. Okay, now there's actually some sort of logic to this. Not only logic, there's actually some sort of more detail to this, exactly how the klippos look. And he says, and it's in other words, you have to think which way are they facing. We know, and that is all again one of the basic questions that you have to ask on everything. If it's punim or ach, in other words, which way it's facing, which way it's intended towards. Now he says it's obvious. Of the Nuk, right? Or in general, actually, also, right? The entire Or Makif and the entire Pnimi, just particularly that's where the Nuk is. So they're facing the Or Pnimi. And that's simple. Because the Or Makif is bigger is the greater outer ways, right? So obviously the klippa, which is going to be fitting into the smallest place, they're actually going to be facing the Or Pnimi Denok. And their back is to the Or Makif Denok. Okay? So now, so in other words, what could the Chetzarim steal, or where are they? Where are we worried about them? And here he says something interesting in the next connection, where he says that now that you realize this might be itself a reason. I'm not sure, and if he says a reason, if that's what caused it, or that's something that's caused by it. It's sometimes confusing with his causality. But he seems to be saying that this upside down, the two different ways. The fact that the Or Makif has the opposite of the Or Pnimi, where the Or Makif, the most external, is the greatest, is actually helpful because it pushes away the klippos. It forces the klippos into the smallest space. Because if the Or Makif would have the same order as the Or Pnimi, where I don't know why the Or Makif the Attic would be Mekoyim that's Or Pnimi the Nuk Deza. If the Or Makif would also work from inside to outside, right? The way I understood it before was if they would be from inside to outside, then they would be together with the Or Pnimi, which is what I remember from Yitzchok, where he talks about the Or Makif being misrachek from the Or Pnimi. But I think that he seems to this. You have to sort of be mafshet this a little bit. He might be talking about the more general idea that I was discussing, that the Or Makif has the opposite way of hierarchy than the Or Pnimi. Because he seems to like, in other words, if the first thing you would meet in Olam Atzilus would be Or Makif the Attic, then the klippos would be close to the Or Makif the Attic. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. It's hard to figure out what he's saying. So this we have to understand this piece, but just I think the more important thing for him is to get you to have the structure in your head, where it turns out that the klippos are exactly between the Or Makif and Or Pnimi Denuk. Which is the Or Makif Denuk Deza. I don't think this is really a reason. We have to think in other places where he talks about this. The main thing he wants to get to is that it turns out that if you find the lowest space in Atzilus, both in the Or Pnimi situation and the Or Makif situation, you end up in the Nuk Tezah, and after that, in other words, between the Or Makif the Nuk and Or Pnimi the Nuk, you end up with klippos, and klippos actually facing Or Pnimi the Nuk, which is where the most dangerous space is. This is like the door of Atzilus, which is where we have to have protection. So going back, okay, I hope that this whole map makes sort of sense, but you just have to have my picture in your head. That's the only thing really. Now we go back to our question of chashmal. So now if you think about it, we just said that the chashmal, right? Now you really have the information in your head to be able to talk about what actually we're talking about when we said that chashmal is imma, which is protecting nuk or zun, nuk and za from the klippus. By the way, he said for a second ago, this piece, I think we skipped it, but he said, when we say the klippus are yonik from zun, as he said before, what we really mean is they get some oil from za, but they actually don't actually touch za. It just means that since the nuk is receiving other earth from za, and they could steal something from nuk, so they're getting also from za. But it doesn't literally mean that the klippus are touching za, because that wouldn't add up in the map that we have. Okay. So now back to where we are. When we're saying that we're afraid of the klippus touching nuk to za or zun, and imma needing to protect them, what we're talking about is the klippus that are standing. That's why we're. So this is really another reason, right? In other words, earlier I told you that generally in zone has klippus and imma doesn't have klippus and so on. And now you actually have this whole map, and you can understand why it must be precisely so, because it's really another kind of much more spatial way of understanding it, right? Where you say the klippus are literally the last thing or the lowest thing in Atzilus, and therefore that turns out to be Nuktaza. Right? So now that you reminded yourself of the structure of how the world looks, you could go back to our question. So since they're close to, has another pasuk that's it's similar to what he said, but it's a different pasuk. I think there's a pasuk that says something like this, right? There's a pasuk in Tehillim. So he understands it like this. Now, we have to okay, now we can understand what this is about. Now, another thing. So now everyone knows the seder of slapshus of imma or abav imma, but especially imma into the za, and we have to understand. We have to conceptualize this levush also in that way. Okay, I want to stop here because I have to make another class. Let's stop here because this is. I'll tell you. Let's finish with this and we'll move on to another one. What?
We're just getting good though.
Yeah, I'm gonna make another recording. So it's a thing. 1 second.